The events related to the taking of hostages in Moscow and coverage of the operation to release them led to a whole group of questions about the correlation between freedom of speech and socially useful legislative restrictions in the activities of the mass media. But in such crisis situations, apparently objectively existing problems are highlighted, which at other times are simply hushed up. Is it so? Or did we deal with a particular problem related exclusively to the terrorist attack?
I agree with your first evaluation, for I don't consider the problems that have arisen to be particular. The passions in newspapers and on television that boiled over in relation to the responsibility of the journalistic community were surface foam. However, they reflected the presence of a very deep, non-understood, or deliberately hushed up in society worldview problem. The time has come to figure it out in a big way. Is television a messenger or a wizard? How does the prognosing of the future turn into the algorithmics of its direct programming by television broadcast? Let us try to prove to our radio listeners that television is not a mirror of life at all, but a fundamental instrument in the hands of terrorists, an integral genre-forming element without which terror and violence in the country on the current scale are impossible in principle. Let's return to those showdowns about the position of the mass media concerning the events of Nordost. Their plot is as follows. The deputies demand amendments to the law on all mass media. Representatives of the mass media are protesting against the infringement of freedom of speech, demanding that the president rejects the amendments. The president vetoes amendments to the law. These events are widely covered as yet another battle for the triumph of democracy. If you read into the essence of the amendments made by the deputies, it will become clear that this is not about the unity of the president and the mass media in this matter. After all, the president rejected these amendments due to the fact that they are meaningless and did not change anything in essence. I have studied these 6 amendments in detail and will illustrate their identical essence on the example of one of them. In the current version of the law on the fight against terrorism, I read, "It is not permissible to disseminate information that can hinder the conduct of an anti-terrorist operation." In the new edition, the words "that can hinder the conduct of" are replaced by the words "hindering the conduct of." The rest of the amendments, take my word for it, are no more profound, and they are just meaningless. The posing of this question in the State Duma was, in my opinion, initiated by the owners of the mass media in order to preempt the posing of questions in relation to the mass media in essence. It is good that our president detected this maneuver. Indeed, if they were approved by the president, then in the future he himself would be used as a scapegoat, because any step of the mass media could anyway be interpreted as a step that does not violate the requirements of the law.
Do you think that laws have no power over the mass media?
Your question hits the mark. Exactly. Moreover, laws are a derivative of the nraviousness of the culture of society, and it's precisely they which in the final reckoning are determined by the mass media, and not the other way around. Our previous programs, the conception of social safety, dead water, maintain that above legislative power, as well as above executive and judiciary powers, there stands conceptual power. The mass media are above law. This is its third priority, an instrument of conceptual power. In any society, laws are always subordinated to the dominant conception, and not the other way around. In order to understand this algorithmics, you need to understand what stems from what. Nraviousness of society gives rise to a pravious, dobro-nravious worldview, or a malnravious and nravless one. The worldview, in turn, forms in accordance with it the corresponding world understanding and the conception of development. From the dominant in society conception stems the corresponding culture and one of its sections, culture of legislation. So, any law is not from God at all. Satanic culture generates satanic legislation when the Inquisition burns at the stake the pravious and those who bring new knowledge. Any dobro-nravious person, and people as a whole, who have not lost contact with God, always distinguish between the concepts of criminality and viciousness. Criminality is connected with the violation of adopted laws. At one time, such pravious people as Christ and Muhammad opposed the vicious criminal legislation. but blind adherence to such laws can ruin society. Viciousness is something that is contrary to God's providence, dobronraviousness. Every law has its own loop, says the ancient folk wisdom. Indeed, not so long ago, people were imprisoned for homosexuality and for spreading this information, and now, by all available means, they contribute to the prosperity of these phenomena in society. A viceless person, under any laws, is endowed with distinction and the sense of measure, and is able to understand that homosexuality is an alien to God's providence perversion, and speculation is parasitism on someone else's labor without creating anything socially useful. We showed these lucid examples in order to make it clear that the health and well-being of a nation, constructivism and creative functions of the mass media cannot be ensured through laws, because they themselves are a product of nraviousness. The President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is 1,000 times right when he says that at the basis of all our problems lies the problem of nraviousness. It also lies at the basis of the outrageousness that television is waging towards society.
Viktor Alexeyevich, after clarifying the correlation between legality and viciousness in the work of the mass media, I would like to return you to the problematics you have designated. Television, messenger or wizard?
As history testifies, life is arranged in such a way that there are people who strive to put the capabilities of other people at their own service. This is done both consciously and on instincts, due to non-understanding. For this, the pseudo-Zhrezes have accumulated the experience of invasion into the psyche of people, bypassing their consciousness with a violation of the given by God and nature algorithms of self-governance of a personality. After such an invasion, a person can be governed in one's own interests, bypassing his consciousness. The arsenal of instruments used is quite wide, from primitive alcohol and tobacco to magic and wizardry. Those who do not believe in the possibility of wizardry nonetheless know that even primitive peoples, before fighting or hunting, arranged rituals during which they made dummies of the enemy or the animal. And then the wizard or magus was entrusted with the task of forming a channel for redirecting governorial information from the modeled object to reality. In the overwhelming majority of cases, modern society forms a view on the world through television programs or through the opinions of acquaintances who, in turn, glean their own views from the same source. An event simply does not take place if it does not appear on a TV screen. But nothing appears on the screen by accident. This is evidenced by at least the fact of the absolute identity of the broadcasting network of all the so-called independent channels. This statistics was recently shown by the newspaper Izvestia. The proportions of the representation of the cult of violence, debauchery, winnings in different TV shows like The Field of Miracles, soap opera series, and the conservation of evil of all colors by humorists are rigidly fixed for any channel. This makes it possible to upload directly on the basis of images into the long-term memory, into the unconscious levels of the psyche of TV viewers, to upload stereotypes of thinking and automatisms of behavior which are desirable for the pseudo-Zhrezes carrying out conceptual power and their local assistants. Herewith, algorithmics of programming of the psyche is no different from that used by magi wizards. If the viewer, and even more so the child, sees Russian folktales where dobro triumphs over evil, then stereotypes of such behavior take shape in him. The daily robbery and violence, large winnings in the fields of miracles outside the sphere of creation, inevitably form and launch other behavioral stereotypes. The resultness and effectiveness of such television wizardry in the 1960s, 70s was established by American sociology. Demonstrations on the screen of violence, debauchery, and lies inevitably and guaranteedly generate this all-permissiveness in real life. Life situations are programmed by behavioral stereotypes from TV. Here is a quote from an article in the Izvestia newspaper issued on November the 23rd, 2002, with the subtitle, "Without television, terrorism makes no sense." Long before the terrorist acts, our domestic television methodically, with the selection of news, the policy of purchasing films, criminal 11 per day programs, prepared us for the role of potential victims of real violence. If someone thinks that the owners of the television air are sowing evil and terror into our society by mistake, or because of non-understanding, then he is deeply mistaken. This ABC of programming life circumstances is well known to them. When their television wizardry at the egregorial matrix level led to the events in Moscow, then, during the days of the tragedy, all everyday nightmares, without exception, were removed from the air. There were only films of Soviet times, with the actors like Kryuchkov, Rybnikov, Tikhonov. They were afraid to get caught in the act of wizardry red-handed. Therefore, the owners of the air understand the difference between dobro and evil is done quite meaningfully.
Could you explain the essence of such concepts as prophecy, prognosing, programming? Without these, it is difficult to fully comprehend the mission of mass media.
Prognoses differ from prophecies not in essence, but in the source of their origin. A prophecy is given to a person from hierarchically high levels of governance in relation to the human psyche, i.e., from the level of egregors formed by the collective psyche or directly from God, the Creator and Almighty. Therewith, a person has the opportunity to more or less adequately announce the prophecy among his own kind. But a prognosis is a fruit of one's own efforts, implemented from the level of the individual psyche. Therewith, negative prognoses, under certain conditions, can perform a positive function of pre-warning when they are given in advance, preemptively, and people in response to them are able to in good time repent, to change their views on what is happening and change themselves and their behavior. However, introducing a negative prognosis into a mindless crowd directly programs the catastrophic future and makes it more likely. There are also well-known sayings on this theme. Invite disaster. Let sleeping dogs lie. It's easier to raise the devil than to lay him. Don't trouble trouble until trouble troubles you. Look at the news programs, and you will see algorithms for direct neurolinguistic programming of catastrophes. A week before some anniversary of the entry of troops into Chechnya, or any other event, daily hysteria begins, according to the scheme, invite disaster. For example, on television they state, according to the information we have, on the day of the anniversary, the terrorists are preparing a series of terrorist acts, and so on. After 1 or 2 tens of such messages, this simply cannot but happen. This is how the egregorial matrix schemes of governance work. This information shakes and activates the egregor, under the leadership of which is the psyche of the organizers and participants of terrorist attacks.
Viktor Alexeyevich, but there is a different kind of saints. You must not blame the mirror for showing a crooked face. Maybe you are dramatizing the role of the mass media in current disasters, and to a greater extent, the mass media simply reflects real life.
I cannot agree with you, and here's why. Take, for example, our region. Different things are happening in it, but maybe I was unlucky, but for all the troubled times of perestroika, I did not manage to see in real life a single serious case of cruel violence. But in television reality, I see it in every news program every day without a single exception. But thousands of other events, which are most important for the life of the city and the region, related to dobro and creation, I do not see on the screen at all. Not only single facts, but even entire systems of our life. For 5 years now, I have not seen on the screen the faces of those who grow wheat, make steel, dress and shoe representatives of mass media as well. But in everyday life I see precisely these dobrous, kind, courageous faces. So the mirror itself looks rather crooked in my opinion. In my opinion, and I am a physicist from my first education, television is more reminiscent of the syncophasitron of horror. The endless reproduction of the catastrophe, the savoring of its details, increases its scale, the consequences in the hearts of people millions of times, causing irreparable psychic damage. A study of the consequences of such television-saturating shows is as follows. In November this year, 67% of the country's population experienced fear, shock. Moreover, it is my deep conviction that it is not explosives and weapons that are the most important attribute of terror, but mass media. The terrorists themselves understand this very well. When Movsar Barayev's accomplice was asked why they had chosen the city center, the answer was more than eloquent. The city center, because everyone will see us. This is a key phrase, and this explains the motivation of the terror. The scenario writers do this solely for the sake of impacting millions, if not billions, of viewers, but not at all impacting a handful of hostages chosen as actors in this bloody performance. Imagine that the worldview and raviousness of mass media were such that, having understood the situation, they would refuse to inform the population on a large scale about an act of terror, i.e., actually refuse from advertising terrorists. Financing such an act would instantly lose all meaning, and therefore it would simply not take place. This is what the president is thinking about today, and at this time he is being asked to engage in meaningless legislative chicanery. In our reality, the mass media act as the main sponsor of terrorist activities. After all, one can sponsor with money, goods, services, weapons, explosives, but these are small things, mere trifles, against the background of innumerable direct sponsorship by media services. Those who have tried to get on air with 10-minute concrete information can imagine what sums of money are equivalent to round-the-clock airtime that is allocated for the advertising of terror, disguised as allegedly needed for the viewers, but not for the terrorists themselves. I think it is hundreds of millions of dollars. To be honest, all these pictures and texts, both on television and in newspapers, should be presented with the heading, Advertising Rights, with an indication of this invisible customer of the broadcast, the advertiser himself. After all, only that cheese is free which is in the mousetrap. Someone may object to me, but this is exposure and criticism of terror, not advertising. I dare to assert that public condemnations and criticism in the mass media is the most effective type of advertising, which manages to turn into national heroes even such empty talkers as Zhirinovsky, Zhuganov, Barkashov, and similar pseudo-patriots. Here is a fresh example. The newspaper Izvestia, issued on December 3, 2002, took 2 pages for the article Fascism Grew Stronger, with a demonstration of 4 photographs with close-up faces, slogans, signs, and fascist reading sources. We managed to get a space for 2 conceptual articles in the size of a quarter of a page in this newspaper, and we remember what a huge amount of money it cost us. But who pushed through advertising pseudo-criticism of fascism, and for what money? And is it really possible that the author of the article, Alexander Arkhangelsky, does not understand that in financing fascism, he is in the same team with the Petersburg banker V. Kogan, criticized by Arkhangelsky? One sponsors fascism, according to Arkhangelsky, with money, the second one with a newspaper strip and bright photographs. The tandem fascists-anti-fascists successfully functions within the framework of the biblical algorithmics of using pawns, divide and conquer. Our books, and above all the conception of social safety, Dead Water, the theoretical platform of the conceptual party Unity, will help you to understand in detail the essence of the provocative content of the mass media.